grants less. So I thought when this job popped up at our studio, I thought it was a great opportunity for me to get to teach people who are not students. So that is people who need to learn the R skills that they need to be able to do a job better. So I get to now interact with more adult learners. I was previously teaching many graduate students back at OHSU, so it was still it was an age mix, but a lot of people in PhD programs or master's programs. And now I get to interact with people from all kinds of different walks and with people with all kinds of different industry backgrounds. And it's definitely different teaching challenges, and it's been really fun. And it also gives me the chance at our studio to be able to funnel those teaching challenges back into actually making the software tools themselves better. So the things that I teach, I try to make better after I teach them. So we're always having like that constant feedback loop so that we can improve APIs, so we can, get rid of errors that we run into that are weird, that are edge cases. So that's really what excites me the most about my current position, is being able to do that, and then also being able to mentor new educators who want to go out there and do it classroom by classroom or workshop by workshop, because we at our studio cannot do all of that. We're really interested in trying to empower educators and try to make their lives easier by creating as much content as we can that's reusable, using our own tools so that people don't have to start over from scratch. Is that long enough? I think it was 5 minutes.
Yeah, that was great. That's great.
That's enough.
I'll let Katie go ahead next.
Sure. So my name's Katie Fitzgerald. I'm a 5th year PhD student in statistics at Northwestern. And I recently accepted a job as an assistant professor of statistics at Azusa Pacific University out in California. So that's where I'll be really launching my teaching career next fall. I do work in statistical methods for social policy kind of broadly. I do a lot of work in data visualization. So R is definitely my friend in that regard. As far as, why do I love teaching? I went to a liberal arts university in undergrad, which was really kind of transformative for me, kind of helping me develop holistically as a thinker, as a scholar, as a person. And so I knew kind of early on that I wanted to return to a liberal arts university for a career. And so that's actually why I pursued a PhD in the first place. But being at Northwestern, I feel like I've really kind of developed a passion for statistics education in particular. And I think this is a really exciting time to be in stats and data science education. We're all living in this world where there's a plethora of data and evidence out there, and statistics obviously is a really powerful tool to kind of help make sense of all that information. And so kind of my mantra as a stats educator is I think that stats education is really an opportunity to teach and to learn how to be better stewards of information. I think we need more people that are thoughtful producers and consumers of data and evidence. And so, yeah, that's really kind of where my heart is at in terms of stats education. But in terms of, like I said, I'm kind of going to be launching my my teaching career next year. But I think the reason Abby invited me here tonight is because I was part of the team that helped to redo the Northwestern Intro Stats curriculum. So about a year ago, 2 faculty mentors and myself revamped that intro course to kind of make it a very heavily R-based course where students, regardless of their background or their major, they're coming in and learning R and the tidyverse in a 10-week quarter. So yeah, happy to kind of talk more about that experience in developing that curriculum. But that's where I'll stop for now.
Thanks. And then our final panelist, Marinia.
Oh, I was just saying, I'm annoying, so I have slides, and they're also so that I keep on task and don't go off on a tangent, which I've been known to do. So thank you for your patience. You guys can see that, okay? Okay, so here, let me actually go to the beginning. Okay, so yeah, I'm Marinia. I'm a health geographer / spatial epi / spatial data science at UChicago. I'm a senior lecturer there. So I teach and do research. I explore how place interacts with and drives health. So I use R in my research. And so just because some people like visual stuff. So here are just different maps I've done in the past, but also kind of statistical analyses using R. Um, and so from like kernel density analyses to spatial social networks, I use R a lot. And then my job is also to teach students and other people how to do that. So all the courses that I teach that include R, there's no programming requirement. So I can have students who've been using R or different programming languages for years, or I can have someone who's brand new. So here's just kind of a smattering of those courses. And then I also, through different kind of grant projects, develop toolkits to kind of customize an intro to R for GIS and spatial analysis things to those communities. So, and I can share this link out. We just did one for opioid research. So looking at how neighborhoods, why does opioid epidemic happen more in some neighborhoods than other neighborhoods? And as you can imagine, the same thing is happening with COVID. So how do we get programming setups to be able to do that kind of complex research? But then I also do a little bit of peer mentoring. So on the one hand, I'll teach students, some students who are hardcore perfectionists at U Chicago who have not experienced making a lot of mistakes before or hardship in their studies. And then they hit my class and they're making mistakes all the time. And that's really frustrating for them, but that's actually really exciting. But I also will teach, clinical health researchers who might be at the top of their field. And then my job is to kind of show them how little they know about both GIS and maybe certain types of art on coding pieces. So it's interesting how people are the same no matter where you are in life. So yeah, so doing that. My favorite part about teaching, and I can touch on some of this during the Q&A, but I love troubleshooting. I make students install everything on their own. We actually include time in class for troubleshooting. And like spend a little bit of time talking about like how do we search for things to troubleshoot? How do we use Google search and like the algorithms within that to help us? For a lot of students, both R and GIS or spatial analysis are both new to them. So there's a lot of pits of despair moments, a lot of aha moments. And a big part of this is like teaching people that sucking at things is actually normal and it's a good thing and it gets better, right? So mistakes are part of learning, and I really love that process. I think maybe there is kind of a hate love thing because the students are hating it while they're going through it, but then I love seeing that yeah they always make it to the other side. And then why R, I'll include, so I tell the students at the beginning too that if anyone asks you, what's better, R or Python, you always answer C and you leave it at that. And that either means the C language is better, which probably is because it is a lot more faster and more efficient, or it means that it just depends on what you prefer. So I use R in our courses because learning the basics are really fast and doable. Like we might not actually be teaching how to program in the classic computer science sense, but we're learning how to use R quickly to get stuff done, and it has that kind of capability to do the bare bone basics, which I really like. In GIS and spatial analysis research, when you're making maps, you can also make maps using a lot of other software, like ArcGIS. ArcGIS is at least $10,000 for a license, which is pretty unaffordable if you're in a community organization or even a public entity. So I think that it's also kind of a very cost-effective, meaningful thing. You're shifting funds and sort of to software to the people who can do more stuff with different things. So, and then also there's like specific reasons within the GIS world where I really like what R has done with the spatial landscape a little bit better than Python for now. And there's just a lot more communities in R that are active in the space than other languages. So that's something else that's exciting. So like, I don't know if you guys remember Opera. That was that was a web browser that was really popular. Well, it was popular with a few nerds because it was a really elegant, very good, it hit all the marks, but nobody used it. So it kind of died, right? So, with R, like, yes, there may be challenges in some ways, but to me, it's more important that there's a really strong community behind it. And that also helps a lot for troubleshooting and that sort of thing. So that's my piece.
Great. Thank you guys so much. So this is really great. I'm going to go ahead and start the panel, and yeah, you don't feel obligated to answer every question. If one or two of you wants to answer, it's fine. But yeah, so the first question we have is, what are the big skills you anticipate students taking away from your respective courses you teach?
I can go. I think for me, one of the bigger focuses that I have now in teaching people sort of outside of an academic classroom is I want to be able to teach people to solve their own problems. So they know what is the tool that I'm using, what are the underlying things that could go wrong, and how do I get myself out of this if I get stuck? Because what I really don't want is to give someone some kind of like sanitized experience that's wonderful, and then they leave my workshop or they leave, the time with me, and then they're totally trapped. Because as opposed to an academic classroom, there's no lifeline left. Once I'm gone, I'm gone. So I really try to instill some basic troubleshooting. But when I did teach like data visualization, for example, I put a pretty strong focus on teaching what one of our guest lecturers with Stephen Few, who you may be familiar with from data visualization. And one of my favorite things that he talked about was data sense making. And I feel like that's a really, really important concept that we often skim over because it's so easy to just start getting into the R stuff and what you can do. And his whole focus was on like thinking sometimes, what is the kind of question that I want to answer? Does the data that I have even help me answer that question? Like, can I even make a visualization here that's worth consuming? So I really tried to instill that in my students. And more currently, I'm kind of sort of grappling with the challenge of teaching a lot of HTML-based tools when HTML fluency is not something that we're all taught in common educational circumstances leading up to a job where you're probably going to have to deal with HTML output at some point. So that's kind of one of my bigger challenges right now is I teach a lot of parts of a toolkit that sort of depend on an underlying framework of HTML fluency, and how do I build that in when I'm teaching people so that it's not all just magic. I want them to understand a little bit about why it looks like magic.
I can go. I would echo a lot of what Allison has said. I think that, it's regardless of what career a student ends up pursuing, like they're going to come across data, right? And so for me, it's important to get them to the point where they can make sense of their own data and kind of like let their own curiosity drive them to solve the problems that they are going to encounter and that they're interested in finding solutions to. So things like just making sure they can read in a data set and clean it, wrangle it, visualize it, and kind of glean some insight from it. So I think like practically that's probably the biggest thing that I would hope that they'd be able to do. And again, kind of using that as really helping them recognize the power of data, because I feel like most, just like the general public, their eyes will just glaze over when they see data or a data set and have no idea what to do with that. And I think a lot of information gets lost in that regard, and people aren't able to harness it, to use it, to make informed decisions. So really kind of equipping them with the skills that they can do that in wherever they go moving forward. And then I think from the statistical perspective, we kind of call statistics the science of uncertainty. And so I think really trying to get them comfortable engaging with uncertainty. And that's something that humans, we don't like to do. We would prefer for things to be certain. But I think R offers like some really nice pedagogical opportunities to get their hands dirty with simulations, for example, and kind of see the ideas of randomness at play in ways that has not been possible in kind of traditional stats courses. So that's another piece that I definitely emphasize in courses is the uncertainty piece and really getting their hands dirty with seeing randomness in action.
So yeah, similarly echoing everything that was said previously. And from a lot of the like the kind of learning environments where I'm working from, it's also really important to spend a lot of time in framing the research question. So R is not something, or I mean, I think any coding language, you're never going to memorize all of the parameter functions. Like that's just not, I mean, maybe there's a few functions that you use a lot, But like I used, read.csv for a really long time, and then I switched to a different package and it's something different now, right? So I think that um, there's not one way to do things. There's actually an infinite number of ways, and then you can also change it and create a new way. So it's a very different way of thinking. So yeah, one of my goals is like think about like what's the research question that you have? What do you want to do first? Like really iron that out, and that's actually a really big task. And then from there, then figure out what functions do you want to do, and then kind of pull those out of your toolbox. So I try to give like students or learners kind of a smattering, or like these are different tools that you might commonly use. Sometimes I'll actually add bugs to labs on purpose, sometimes not on purpose, sometimes on purpose. So that like it's really funny the first time that happens, because someone will be like, oh, there's something's not working here. And I'll be like, you know what, you're right. What do you think that is? And they'll like there's a little bit of a resistance of like, well, shouldn't you know? Like you're the teacher, or you're my lifeline. You're supposed to resolve these things for me, right? And so initially there's a resistance when I push that back. I'm like, well, I don't know. Let's sit here until someone figures it out, and then let's go through all the troubleshooting pieces. I think that kind of flipping is really important, and I mean, otherwise you can't be successful if you can't do coding outside of your class, right? Then it's going to be that one traumatic class that you try to avoid for the rest of your life.
Great. Yeah. So I know we talked a little bit about like the idea of tools and tools. I think a lot of you have used it to kind of say it's like a line of thinking, a line of questioning and inquiry as you learn. But practically, what for the course, specifically for the courses you've taught and have experience with, what are your favorite R related resources and like course materials, things like that? Like, what do you think works best?
I can go. Maybe I'll screen share real quick. Can I do that? Is that okay? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Share. So I made the education site for our studio, which is a collection of things that I think are great learning resources for people. We had our one of my interns 2 summers ago, Desiree DeLeon, who now works at our studio with me. She designed all the custom artwork here. So you can climb Nacho Mountain for beginners. And this link will take you to, this is kind of like, I guess, my answer to all the people, especially once I joined our studio, who are like, hey, I've always wanted to learn R. Where do I start? These are like 6 links, 6 kind of things that we think are the best places to get started. And fun fact, data driven, this is the most visited page on this website, like week after week. It blows everything else on this website out of the water, and all other RStudio links as well across the board. So beginners is a popular one, but there are also some suggestions for intermediates. So if you're ever kind of like feeling like, well, I'm not a beginner, but I want to know what are the latest resources, we do keep this up to date. And then there's also a page for experts as well, kind of giving you links to kind of the latest like versions of advanced R, since it's being updated. So we try to link out when there's a development version of things. And for teachers, we also have a teach section that has some pointers to how to learn to teach, but also materials for teaching is extremely helpful, and tools for teaching. So the tools for teaching kind of describes like infrastructure and ways to use it for teaching, but materials links you out to a bunch of our developed workshops and courses that we have. So those are some of my favorite resources to share with people. And I made it basically because I was getting inundated with questions all the time and on Twitter. And it's just so much easier to have a link, which is part of what I think is awesome about having more HTML fluency is it's always easier once you have a link to just be able to share it, and it scales really well. It's amazing. Other than that, I do have some like links on my website to projects that I've worked on that I think are pretty good, and teach data visualization and some other concepts. But also I think Stat 545 is a resource developed by Jenny Bryan. And it was one of the first things that I worked on at our studio to port it over to a Bookdown website. And I think that's a really great place to send new learners as well. So those are my plugs.
That was pretty awesome. Also, yeah, just an FYI for everyone. Allison has, speaking of HTML fluency and blog down, she has some really good materials about like building your own personal website with Hugo and all of that. So yeah.
And I'll give a spoiler that like we're about to do giant upgrades to all of this documentation. So like, in the next like 3 months or so, there will be a whole new R Markdown website and a lot of new learning materials. So related to blog down as well. And we're making some big changes to make it more usable and more user friendly. So
Very cool. Katie?
Yeah, so I'll share a link here. I love anything that Mina Chitinkaya Rundell puts out. I think she might have held a similar role to you, Allison, at our studio. She's currently at Duke and the University of Edinburgh. And so she's very good with developing pedagogy. And she has pretty much all of her course material is available on her GitHub, and any like talks that she gives or anything is all available on her GitHub. So I'll send that link as well. But she has a few courses that are fully available. She has something called Data Science in a Box. That's kind of an intro data science course that I very much am planning to rely heavily on as I step into new roles there. And so, yeah, I think anything by her is excellent. And then if anyone is in need of an intro stats course using the Tidyverse, I'm happy to share our materials that we used. We have kind of an open source textbook to go along with that as well.
All right, and I have my video on and off because my Wi-Fi is ebbing and flowing. So it's interesting because like for the stuff that we do, we're kind of expecting people to on-ramp very quickly. So I'll share a lot of resources. Some of the resources were shared here already at the very beginning, like even before the class starts. But otherwise, I've become a really big fan of like learning by like different applications or scenarios, right? So like here's a problem. What would we have to figure out how to, what packages we'd have to grab, what would we have to learn in order to solve it in R? And there hasn't, I found that there's not as much resources in that kind of piece. So we've been starting to create more kind of application specific things around that. So like here's a toolkit we just did with it's not technically NIH, it's NIDA, which is within NIH, and they get mad if you call them NIH, but they're not technically NIH. But we just created this like a toolkit that was basically for those who already knew a little bit of R, but wanted to scale up, but kind of presenting it that way. And but for example, we're going to be doing this same toolkit for a GIS audience next Monday. And that's going to be a very different tone because they'll already know GIS, but they'll be really afraid of R, right? So we're kind of working in this almost like niche space where there's still a little bit of a gap in there's a lot. I mean, that being said, you probably all know Angela Lee. She was really active in Our Ladies and also from U Chicago. Or she was one of my yeah, she worked on some of my projects as well. But she's developed a lot of really excellent like intro to spatial analysis tutorials as well. But again, it seems like if you're learning R and you're learning or if you're learning spatial analysis, oftentimes there needs to be a little bit more information about how we use things and why we do them and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's the tricky part, but we're still working on it. And that being said, my favorite text is for these topics is Geocomputation in R by Lovelace and some other guys, Yakub and some other guys. That's usually set up as an introduction, but I actually use that for my advanced course because it takes a while to really figure out why to use certain functions and when to use them and that sort of thing. So it's tricky. I think the more applied you get, it can get pretty tricky.
Awesome. So what tends to be the part of your class, your course, or a workshop that you taught that you find students enjoy the most? And then what exactly do you think they struggle with the most? I know we talked about just like being wrong and having to work through that. But if you have any like particular things for the material you teach that enjoy and do not enjoy.
I can say that one thing that kind of has surprised me recently is how much, like, especially with remote education becoming, more normal, and we're all kind of doing this over Zoom all the time. I'm finding that students like having a little bit of time where it's just kind of like free time to ask questions. So I often do like breakout rooms where I kind of pop into smaller breakout rooms and can talk to people. And that seems like that's kind of a little bit of a relief. I think it's really hard with remote education now to feel like you're respecting people's time though also. So I try to be really conscious of that. So I think like right now it's just kind of, it's hard doing any kind of education. I feel like things are just kind of breaking my heart left and right. Like I hear people saying they can't go into their team's breakout room because they've got their 4-year-old behind them and it's climbing on their back and they don't want to turn on their video, so they don't feel like they can bring down their whole group. And so it's kind of a tough time, I think, for everybody, and that's kind of a different flavor of hard than I've experienced before as an educator, because it's like everybody's going through their own kind of personal awful circumstances and everyone's is different. And it's really hard to anticipate what's hard for people right now. But I can assume that anytime I'm asking people to give of their time, it's hard. You just don't know what's going on with them. What I think people enjoy a lot also is being able to watch somebody live code, and that's really hard to make time for. And I would probably rewrite this article differently, but Greg Wilson and I, with 2 other colleagues, published an article recently about participatory live coding and how to do it. And it was sort of right before the pandemic. So now it's like kind of a different thing to do live coding when you're remote also. It's kind of odd. But I find that that's kind of easier. It's kind of fun. It's kind of a nice way to connect with people, even though you feel like it's weird because it's all screen. So I think those are sort of pandemic highs and lows, which I don't know if they really count as highs, but
Yeah, plus one for live coding. Any class I've TA'd for, people really appreciate watching you make mistakes, watching you think through like, okay, how do I fix this? So I totally get that.
Yeah, and it takes some of the pressure off. I don't like making people feel like they go into a breakout room and they've got this like blank slate in front of them and they're supposed to fill it in with code. That's really hard.
Yeah, I would say I think students really love the data visualization piece. They get pretty impressed with themselves, I think, when they can create these, pretty fancy visualizations that they've only seen in the business world or in marketing or whatever. And so I think they have a lot of fun with that. One thing that I've found that people have enjoyed is it makes it really easy, particularly in the online setting. But if you have a Google form that you can like live survey them essentially and kind of get some like live data. And then the Google Sheets has a feature where you can publish to a CSV. And so you can just get a link to then send that link out, and the students all then have access to this like live data in a very quick turnaround, and you don't have to deal with file paths or anything like that. So it's a pretty convenient thing, and I think they tend to enjoy that, particularly because it's they're working with data that's relevant to them because they just produced that data just a few moments before. So I've seen that activity. People enjoy that. I would echo, I think the biggest challenge is anxiety. It's kind of like a terrifying mix of math anxiety and coding anxiety. But I think a couple things that help with that, which we've kind of already alluded to. One is just like to name it and normalize it. And, I think programming is a great way to kind of foster a growth mindset, because like we've talked about, errors are inherently part of the process, even for experts. And I think that process of like getting error messages and trying to diagnose a problem and coming up with a plan to fix it, that's like the same type of mindset that you want to foster in learners in general. Instead of just like totally freaking out and shutting down when something's wrong, but actually using it as a diagnostic tool to figure out like and pinpoint where the misunderstanding is, where the problem is. So I think it's actually a really valuable and transferable skill. And then the other piece that I think helps with anxiety is to kind of, ideally from a pedagogical perspective, you want to use tools that have a low floor and a high ceiling, right? And so to teach in such a way that you make the floor as low as possible. So one of the things that we did in our course was that we used our Markdown documents for all of their in-class activities. So they start with a knittable document at the beginning of class on day one, where they can, just click the button and they've all of a sudden produced an HTML document from their own computer. And so the woman that I mentioned earlier, Mina, she kind of has a nice talk that basically is making the point. The title of the talk is "Let Them Eat Cake." And so kind of like let them do the fun, exciting things first. And so they can kind of get to see what's possible, and then go back and make them deal with the wrangling and all the cleaning. That's kind of the nitty gritty stuff that we get frustrated with, but really give them some insight into like the power of what they could do with these things. And then I think that gives them a little more motivation to push through the anxiety and all the errors.
I'm going to steal that from one of my classes, Katie. I love that. So another thing that maybe that has come up in classes that is kind of unexpected is the question of authorship. So so I like when I'm doing my work, there's a lot of copying and pasting, right? So this is a snippet from this Stack Exchange that works. So I'm going to integrate that and then look at 5 other, posts or documentations and kind of piece things together. And I've learned, or as I develop a better like relationship with students, eventually they're like, "How can you do that? You're just plagiarizing all over the place." Um, and I'm like, no, 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 no. That's actually what the part of it is like, no, that's what we're all doing. But then that's not the right answer either, right? But it's just such a different way of doing science or, doing knowledge production. Like it's a shared collaborative work that is not something, yeah. So on the one hand, there's kind of like, well, and so for me with live coding, even that can be a challenge because I rarely, like when I'm coding, I rarely type things out letter by letter. Like I take this chunk from something I did last week and I copy and paste it and I switch out the name, right? So do I type everything or, or do I just copy and paste? Like I still kind of struggle with that, like when to do which piece. So I think that that's something that, yeah, similarly, I don't know if there's a really good way to kind of communicate that. I feel like we like every time this comes up from the class, we kind of just talk it out and it makes sense in the end. I think, but just how does knowledge production work? I'll talk a little bit about open source workflows and licenses and how important it is to cite. Even if you did pull a snippet from somewhere else, you can actually, when in doubt, just add kind of an introduction or comment out some code at the beginning. But that's a kind of a fascinating topic that seems to be getting more interest over the past few years, which is kind of unexpected.
Cool. So this might be a weighty question. I don't know, but the big base R versus tidyverse divide. Someone submitted a question like, do we teach tidyverse first? Yeah, if you could just talk a little bit about your personal philosophy on that.
I shall wade in. I hate this argument so much. I don't know how you teach tidyverse without teaching any base R. I really don't know how. Like, I don't know how you teach anything to do with mutate if you don't know mean, min, max, median. Like, I don't know how you get through if you don't know your basic arithmetic operators like, equals, in, those things. How do you know how to filter anything? I feel like it's a complete false dichotomy, and I feel like use what makes you happy and what you can explain to other people when you're teaching. I always think back, I think David Robinson had a really great blog post a few years ago that was like, he judges what he wants to teach with by the number of times he has to say, I'm sorry to students. So the number of times you have to be like, oh no, wait, I'm sorry, this thing goes this way, or oh no, wait, I'm sorry, the argument is this, but there's a period in between the two words instead of a camel case for this other one. Like, that's what drives me, and that's why I've generally taught with tidyverse first. But I always teach them, like, if you look in my website, I have a data visualization course where I did this, where at the beginning of every lecture I'd talk about like base R and tidyverse are two peas in a pod. Here's what you need to know from base R to be able to use these tidyverse functions effectively, because otherwise you're just holding a mutate and you have no idea what to do with that. So I personally feel like it's trumped up and it's meant to divide people, and I also feel like it's it tends to feel a little, I see it on both sides, I understand, but it also tends to feel a little controversial where there's actually no controversy. So I feel like I am done with that argument. So I will leave my stake in the ground there.
So I'll say we kind of took the team tidyverse approach in our revamp of the Northwestern curriculum, but actually I do appreciate that more nuanced perspective, because I think you're right. It's not an either or. In fact, we actually, I think the first time around kind of underestimated the amount of base R that they would need to use the tidyverse well. So in particular, like with filter, we realized that they had no, and part of this was just like logic, but they had no understanding of how to put together and or statements to be able to filter the way that they were wanting to. So I think, yeah, you have to have both. But I do think the tidyverse offers some pedagogical advantages in terms of like the pipe function, for example, I think is really helpful in kind of breaking it down into more digestible pieces. I think it's easier to kind of read like you would a sentence. So I think there are some pieces that are more intuitive in that way. And I think from a data viz perspective, like ggplot is just, you can't beat it. And again, from a pedagogical perspective, the really like the grammar of graphics and being able to kind of teach that as a language, I think is really valuable.
Katie, I'm just going to go ahead because I think this fits well here. Someone asked on the Google form, especially for you, that they had a lot of their stats classes taught in base R, like specifically stats functions in R are more reliant on base R instead of tidyverse. So they're curious how exactly you felt like that was integrated in your intro course.
Yeah, and one of the things kind of as the course went on, we did realize that like it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to like just strictly be team tidyverse all the time, because there are things that are just much more straightforward to do in base R, and a lot of the stats functions are just better and easier, and you don't have to really think through like how to get this into a tidy format and all of that. And so I think particularly for some of the statistical analyses, base R is actually the way to go, and it makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I don't know if it's very helpful or not, but I would say, yeah, we definitely echoing Allison here that I think it's a both and.
And this is a big issue in spatial stats too. So in addition to base R versus tidyverse, there's two competing frameworks, SP, which was the old way, like akin to base R, and then now SF, which is tidyverse friendly. And in a lot of, but not everyone in the spatial community has shifted to the new framework. So what I find is like if you only teach tidyverse, and suddenly you want to do point pattern analysis, none of the data structures, like it's a different data structure, right? And how you call data is different. So it's not compatible. And yes, you could just switch everything to the older format, but it's still not quite like it's hard. It gets harder to resolve errors if you don't understand the logic behind it. So I end up doing this kind of hybrid, we'll mainly learn tidyverse, but then sometimes we'll kind of take a step back to rewind and do a little bit of R or the base R pieces. But it's a lot for people to take in. I think that's a challenge. If you're a learner, it like the competing data structures and how packages work, right? How packages can actually support different data structures. It can be pretty tricky. Yeah, and then it doesn't help that the communities can be very competitive with each other, right? And then there's like the data table folks, and yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you guys. That was really great. We have, a couple questions that have been submitted through the Google form, so I'm going to just go through those. So I feel like I definitely know Allison's answer to this, but I'm curious for the other two panelists' answers. Do you get more requests to teach than you're able or willing to accommodate? How do you choose what to say yes to?
Well, so my approach lately has been to develop more. I think so. The first answer is yes, definitely. The need is much higher, or the demand is much higher than the supply of teachers and that sort of thing. But I also think it's partly the materials, right? You have to like know enough about how to hunt online to find the different materials. It's not like people have asked me like, isn't there just a textbook that you recommend? Um, and any textbook that exists will immediately be outdated. Um, so um, so yeah, but I think that having better learning resources that are more like standardized. So like I think that the projects that Allison, that you guys, or our studio, have been working on are excellent. But then I can imagine that could also get competitive, right? Um, with other groups who think that they're creating their own education series at like the data camps or whatnot, right? Um, but yeah, and saying no, I've learned to get grants and then write in develop toolkit into a grant, and then hire people to help develop that. So that's been my latest strategy. Put it into the budget.
I can say that when I was at Oregon Health and Science University, I did exactly what you just described. When I got to the level where I was the PI on grants, I budgeted for it so that I'd be able to make time for it. So I had like a budget line for dissemination and training. And I made sure that I was able to train people on my teams and that I was able to kind of pay it forward at my institution too. So I really tried to find structural ways to make sure that what I was doing wasn't volunteer training or teaching, but that it was like not just going to get paid, but also like recognized by my organization, so that when promotion and tenure time came up, I didn't feel like I had donated my time and my energy to something that didn't help me out in the end. So I really was very conscious of that when I was on a promotion and tenure track, to make sure that that was never volunteered.
All right, Katie, do you have any thoughts, or should I go to the next one? Okay. All right. So this one, how do you engage with or encourage people who've had a piecemeal experience with R and they come away frustrated and they come to you? Now what?
Well, that's how I learned. So I feel like lucky that people actually get to take classes. So part of it is like, welcome to the club. I hear your frustration and, and that part of it. But the other part too is like you can't learn everything at once, right? So like in exchanges like that, the question really becomes like, well, what are you trying to do? Like what excites you the most? Are you trying to make a really cool visualization? Do you want to dive into the statistics? Are you trying to build a product? Like, do you want to create an app, like a web application for your portfolio? Are you trying to do some research for an article? Right. So if you just want to run some stats, maybe you don't need to learn all the other stuff. And just getting a couple snippets of what other people have done will be enough.
I think that's really powerful, and that's typically what I would do too, is try to find out like what were they trying to do, because most people, if they embark on the journey of, oh, I want to learn R, you're not going to be successful because there's no way you're going to learn all of R. I don't feel like I know. I've learned R. Like, I know how to do things in R, and I can do certain things in specific subsets, but I don't like feel like I know R. Like multiple times a day, somebody slacks me a message with code, and I'm like, I have no clue what that does. There's just like there's all these rough edges that I have no clue because I've never needed to use them for my job. So I think most people have had a mismatch of bad experience and not totally. They didn't know the space that they needed to be in to be successful. So there's kind of that mismatch that happens. And typically, I think like workshops and webinars kind of get a little bit of a bad rap, but I often think that that's like a great way to get somebody to deliver for you a mental model, essentially. Because like what you were lacking probably was a mental model to start with of the space that you needed to learn. And even if you don't get a workshop that's great, or even if you don't get one that has even hands-on anything, I feel like it gives you the vocabulary to be able to figure out like, okay, I totally didn't understand this, but I need to know how to do this for my job. So I need to find resources that help me with this. Because if you're just looking for like are resources and searching randomly, you're just going to have darts going everywhere, and it's going to be an unfortunate experience.
I think a lot of it is learning how to Google effective, like what the language is behind it. I 100% agree.
Yeah, so if you can like do like a quick workshop, like if you can find somebody who's doing a webinar or, you know, a quick workshop that's, especially now that things are remote, there's so many wonderful remote workshops that people are offering. And you can often find them on YouTube if you missed them live. I think that's kind of really powerful for helping people just figure out like what's the landscape that I need to learn.
And a language the languages metaphor is also really powerful. This doesn't work if you're working with a group that only like that have never tried to learn a different language before, but like I'll share the story where like, you know, I tried to learn Spanish. I've been in Spanish classes since I was in junior high and high school and even part of college, and I could barely speak, right? It was this total piecemeal, you know, experience, but then when I actually went to countries where Spanish was spoken and was forced to do that on a daily basis and make a million mistakes and embarrass myself, but then have the community like, you know, support me. I learned within 2 weeks what took me like 10 years to piece together. And that for some reason, like especially for ESL learners, they're like, oh yeah, like, hey, like I can already speak 2 or 3 languages, which is more than my teacher can. So maybe, you know, maybe the struggle is like not that different, you know.
Yeah, I would echo all of that, and just kind of make the point that like I think we're all saying that like the best way to learn is to do, and that's like how it happens in real life. So I'd say that we should take that mindset and bring it into the classroom as well. Like, why do we think that we need to teach in the classroom in this very just like traditional structured way? But we should actually leverage that like people actually learn best when they're needing those skills to do something that they want to do and that they want to find the answer to. And so, yeah, just a plug for like real life data, answering real questions. That's going to be really the motivator to get them to learn these things.
Thank you guys. I think we have time for like 1 or 2 more final questions. Is that okay? All right. So someone asked about like the virtual setup. I think Allison talked a little bit about the virtual environment and kind of what is kind of the hardest or most unexpected online or teaching situation you've encountered recently, and how'd you overcome it?
I don't know that it's unexpected because it's totally expected, but it's the tech problems. It's like you set up like everything ahead of time, you test it. You're like, okay, my husband has a Windows machine. I'm going to go test it over there. You can test everything. And then you get in there and things fail, or even things fail on my setup that like it drives me bonkers. And I think that's just kind of one of those things that in remote setups can feel a little, I don't know, for some reason more scary than in live classrooms, because you feel like you're literally just like in a bedroom or something. And you're like, I have no lifeline. I have nobody to message to help because I'm just here and I'm just, you know, stuck with this error message that I can't figure out. And I'm the instructor. So I had this recently when I was I forget what workshop I was teaching, but I was doing a remote workshop, and the very first document that they knit wouldn't knit for some arcane reason, and it knitted the day before. And it was not the experience. Like I really try to like make people be able to knit right away, and then we kind of go through and make slides together, and it didn't work. And I still don't exactly know what happened. There was some installation problem on my cloud setup. It was all complicated, but it's hard to get over those when they happen. But I've kind of learned to just like take a deep breath. Everybody's like experiencing this even more so now because we're all on Zoom all the time and things are happening. So I found that people are extremely wonderful and nice. I also recently did a workshop where they made me use Microsoft Teams instead of Zoom. And it was the beginning of a 2-day workshop, 2 days. And my screen share didn't work. So my partner who was at our studio on the customer success side had to screen share my slides and had to increment them every time. So I had a hand signal for incrementing my slides for 2 full days. And that was awful. It was horrible. And you'll never get me to use Teams again after that.
say time zones are another challenge. So for me, like last spring, and so even this next quarter where I'll be teaching, I can't do synchronous, or I don't believe I should do synchronous learning because too many of my students are in different time zones, and I don't want to give the ones who have a class at 2 p.m. a better advantage than the ones at 3 in the morning. So for me, I had to switch to a model where I'm coding, like I ended up using Panacto. So there's a screen. Um, you can see me like coding and doing stuff in the screen. You can see my face in another, like a smaller screen, and then there's a like a log of that kind of bookmarks the video. So it's something that people have to watch. And I did that this last spring, and it worked out really well, except for 2 or 3 students who were really quiet, kind of introverted, were kind of scared to, like the students that I could catch in a live session, a synchronous session, or in person. I still haven't found a good way to kind of capture those guys. But it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and the kind of final question. It's 2 questions. One is about any resources, institutions, agencies that support people who are interested in our education, if you had specific recommendations for those. And then the second question is maybe a little more personal to you. What's next for you in terms of like our curriculum development and education? Like, what do you want your next our teaching pedagogy related project to be?
I can go. I I am really focused recently on trying to make our Markdown easier to teach and learn. So I'm working a lot with, if anyone has seen the more recent development version of the RStudio IDE, we have a visual Markdown editor now, which I think is going to be really powerful to empower students to kind of, have this like what you see is what you get experience when they're typing. So I'm working on, kind of new materials for the RStudio, our Markdown website to kind of help like people on board with the visual Markdown editor first. And then also I'm working with one of my colleagues, Tom Mock, who's at RStudio, and we are revamping our Markdown education site to include a lot of stuff that we think is sort of like the hidden curriculum of our Markdown. So I think a lot of times what at least I did previous to joining RStudio was I taught with our Markdown, but I never really taught our Markdown because it was kind of complicated. So I kind of was just like, just use it, just run chunks and just knit. And I never really explained much about like knitter chunk options and YAML options and output formats and output options. I didn't talk about all of that stuff. And so I'm trying to build out an online resource to help people to be able to figure that out, because I think there's a lot of our Markdown users that at least come into my workshops called Advanced R Markdown workshops, and people are like, what are knitter chunk options? What are these words that you're using? And I'm like, all right, we have not like made that clear enough to people. It's complicated, and there's a lot of variability in what people are coming in with. So we're going to try to kind of level the playing field a lot. So we're really excited about that stuff. So that'll be like in the next 3 to 6 months.
Yeah, so I don't know that I have a good answer to the first question that was asked in terms of resources, but in terms of what I'm working on next, I have kind of a suite of Shiny apps that I've developed to kind of teach statistical inference, and I'm hoping to expand on that, in part because I'm kind of moving into a new challenge in this new role that I'm going to be taking as an assistant professor, because I'm going to be the main statistician that's kind of in charge of the undergrad curriculum, and I am told that I will kind of be in charge of a team of adjuncts that teach a lot of the intro stats courses. And so I'm probably not going to be able to rely on the fact that the adjuncts themselves will know R. And so I think it might take a while before I can fully introduce R into the intro curriculum. So I'm kind of trying to think about ways that I can still leverage the power of R to bring that into the classroom, but do so in a way that the instructors themselves don't have to actually do the programming and know how to use R. So yeah, kind of planning to expand that repertoire of Shiny apps that I've been working on.
So for resources, I'd really recommend not framing, like when you're asking for resources, I don't recommend framing it as I'm looking for our resources for our education. I would instead frame it as I'm looking for resources to facilitate open science and reproducibility and that sort of thing. Because I think that at least for the folks who have funding to hand out, like that kind of hits the right tone, and it really is a huge service to science, right? To do things that are reproducible. It, I mean, like it's a massive like revolution and transformation to kind of, like anyone can be a coder, right? Like I see coding now as kind of just a different like language. Like you write like I, a long time ago, I did an MFA in writing and like even learned how to teach writing, but it's actually really similar to coding, right? Like it's like it takes a while and you iterate a little bit and you kind of keep on going. So framing as open science, and then thinking about those kind of critical thinking skills that we've been talking about today, like that if you're looking at an education grant, potentially you could go for an education grant and bring in those concepts of critical thinking, computational thinking. There's a whole thread on that as well. So different things like that might be useful. Um, and oh yeah, and then for next or for future things. So one thing that like that's been a project for mine for like 1 or 2 years is to again, and I already mentioned some of this, like to develop better kind of intro application based resources for learning R, but like hidden within research questions. So it's like, how can you learn R without realizing that you're doing it? Um, so working, I mean, we'll see that where that goes, but I'm also really excited just to continue to kind of, I feel like we need to have better curations of other stuff that's happening. So like on the GIS side, there's some awesome work by Lovelace, but then this other group just developed this really amazing toolkit to do that, to focus on like front end, like all the kind of, yeah, like the interactive visualizations piece of it. And so it feels like, and I've seen a few, blog posts that will just have a bullet list of all these things, but I think that like something like that, we need to get better curation service for all the different tutorials so that people can figure out what works for best for them.
Great. Well, thank you guys. Yeah, thank you so much to our panelists. That was really, really awesome. I think actually the title I put on the meetup was correct, like it was inspiring. I want to thank also my fellow R ladies. The board of Chicago's here, and also this meetup was co-hosted with R Ladies East Lansing. So I'd like to thank them and the people that came out from East Lansing, and just everyone for being part of this community. And yeah, so we have the room for, a good chunk of more time if people want to stick around. And I know there were a couple of questions I didn't get to. And so I'd love to just like discuss those casually, or if people, have specific things they want to say to the panelists. Otherwise, yeah, thank you so much for coming out, guys.
Thank you so much on behalf of East Lansing too. Thank you.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people are heading out, so I don't know. Goodbye. I'll be around.